So in this class, as we're learning how to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space and three-dimensional volumes on a flat surface, you'll find that I often talk about planes. So P-L-A-N-E-S, planes and planar structure. So when I say plane in this context, what I'm talking about is similar to the the concept of a plane geometry. So what I'm talking about is basically a flat surface. Okay, so a flat surface like a piece of paper, right? A plane, the geometric definition of a plane is a two-dimensional surface that has no thickness. So something like this. So the question is, how does this apply to what we're doing? As I'm going to explain in a moment, we can think about the three-dimensional objects we're trying to paint as being constructed of a series of planes that fold into one another or that turn into one another. And the planes on those objects each respond to the light in a different way. And so that planar structure of the object and the way each of those planes is responding to the light helps us create a convincing illusion of a three-dimensional volume in space. And conceiving of objects as planar structures, so seeking out and finding a kind of underlying planar simplicity is, in my opinion, the best way to successfully create a sense of three-dimensional volumes on a flat surface. And that approach to painting, seeking out or understanding three-dimensional objects as a planar structure goes back centuries. It was one of the developments in the Italian Renaissance that helped artists really make significant advances in their ability to create the illusion of three-dimensional volume on a surface. This is by way of explanation. This is what I mean by a plane. So we're going to talk about a flat surface as it applies to the objects we're painting. A couple other things about a plane. We can think of a plane both as a flat surface, but we can also think of a plane for our purposes as a flat surface that's bent or slightly twisted or bowed. That will also be relevant to us. And just before we go on, I want to show one more thing. So I'm going to take this plane, I'm going to fold it. Okay. So I'm going to, from that one plane, I've created two planes. And so you're looking at two planes right now that have a different orientation to the light source. So the two planes, as you know, those two planes have the same local color and the same local value. Like, in other words, when these two planes that I've created by folding one plane, when these two planes are facing the light source in the same way, they have the same value. So in other words, the same degree of lightness or darkness, and they have the same color. So when we talk about the sort of general, generic color or value of something, without regard to the light that's being shown on it, we refer to that as local color or local value. So the local color of this card is, a kind of light tan or off-white. And the local value of this card is very light or approaching white, right? That's the local color and the local value. But as these planes have different orientations to the light source, the local value and the local color changes dramatically, right? So this plane here is facing the light source, so it's strongly illuminated, and we can clearly see its local value and its local color. This plane is turned away from the light source, so we no longer see the local color or the local value. The local color and local value have entirely changed. So this local value now is a very dark gray, and its color is a very dark warm gray. It is nothing like the near white or the very light value of this plane. So those properties of planes, the way they respond to light, is going to be something very important for our purposes. The other reason this is important is if I want to create the illusion of something moving through space. So if I have a flat surface, as we do, if I have a flat surface, something like the canvas that I'm going to make a painting on, and I want to create the illusion that something is moving from a point in space closer to us to a point in space further away, it's relatively easy to do that with a plane, right? All I have to do is turn that plane and represent it as being in perspective. So you're seeing this end of the plane as smaller than this end of the plane. So that creates immediately the illusion of something moving through space. And we're going to learn how to apply those basic principles to more complex elements that we're going to be drawing and painting. Okay, so this week I'm going to be looking at a simple object. So I sent everybody an image of that simple object. And so please, if you can, have that image to refer to. That's the object I'm working from. And what I'm going to be doing is doing a demonstration on how to analyze that object so that we see that complex organic form as a volume made up of a sequence of planes, each with a different orientation to the light source. And for next week, I would like everybody to do something similar. So take a simple organic object and analyze it so that you interpret it as a series of planes. And I'll talk more about, or I'll show that more in depth in the demonstration. So, okay, so before I do that, I'm gonna go to my camera, and I'm gonna go through a few preliminaries, as I did last week, just in terms of setting up your space, just to remind people of some of the things you'll want to do as you begin your work day using oil paints. It's probably the last time I'll do that. But just as a reminder for everybody, and in case anybody wasn't here last week. Okay, so. Okay, so can everybody see, everybody sees my setup?
Yes.
Okay. So as I'm doing this demonstration, please let me know if you can't hear me well. When I didn't watch the whole thing, but when I watched part of the demo last week, the sound wasn't so good. So just let me know if you can't hear me well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is train the camera on my work table. Okay, so again, I just want to show people a couple things. So I have my palette, I have my rags, my paper towels, my cloth rags. I just want to remind people, I guess for the last time, about reusing mineral spirits. So these are mineral spirits that, again, I used yesterday while I was painting. And the mineral spirits got very muddy by the end of the day. But again, what happens is those minerals, the mud all of that used paint settles to the bottom of the container. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a transfer jar. So you want to have one of these. And I'm going to pour out the clean mineral spirits. And I'm going to keep pouring until I start to get a little of the residue from yesterday's painting. And I'm just going to stir that up and dump that out into that sludge jar that you're going to need to keep somewhere. And remember, you can't, obviously I don't have any control of this, like we tried to in the studio at Queens College, but technically you can't dump this down the drain. It's bad for your plumbing. It's terrible for the environment. So you want to be putting that, be reusing this as much as possible, again, to save yourself money. But also you want to eventually dispose of this in the trash, not down the drain. So I'm gonna put these away. Okay. So just again, so people can see, I'm going to be doing a demonstration on this panel, but that's the still life I'm working from. So again, that's the type of situation you want to set up, a box with your object and your light source. And, okay. So for this week, we're going to continue to use just white and black. We don't need anything other than that, okay? So I want to talk for a few minutes for a few minutes about planar structure in general before we talk about interpreting an object in terms of its planar structure. Okay? So I'm going to add, on this gray panel, I'm going to ask everybody to imagine a situation. So let's say we have a surface here. So we have a tabletop. And let's imagine this is a tabletop, and we have a light source similar to the light source we use in this class. We have a light source coming from the upper left. Okay? We have a light source, something like that. I'm going to imagine two simple forms in this space. So I'm going to imagine a simple cube and then I'm also going to imagine something a little bit more complex. I'm going to imagine a geometric form, but a more complex one. So let's see if I can draw this. I'm going to imagine a 12-sided object, which we call a dodecahedron. So I have a cube, and I have next to it a dodecahedron. We're just going to imagine that. And these are geometric forms. They're sometimes referred to, if anyone's taken geometry, these are referred to as platonic solids. Because I guess, or I'm pretty sure, the reason for that is Plato was the one who conceived of these. So these are called platonic solids, or they're somehow associated. So thinking about what we talked about a few minutes ago, we talked about planes, what a plane is. And then we talked about how we can apply that idea of planes to the painting of three-dimensional objects in space. So I'm just going to clean up my dodecahedron a little bit. My imperfect dodecahedron, but it'll do. So these are two objects that are very clearly constructed of planes. So there's no confusion, right? So so my cube, a cube is made up of 6 planes, and it's relatively easy when using geometric solids to convince the viewer that this flat surface is actually a space through which objects are moving, right? So because I've drawn this cube in perspective, we have a sense that the plane on the left is moving backwards in space like this. The plane on the right is moving backwards in space like this. The top plane is receding away from us at a similar oblique angle. We can say the same thing about the planes on the dodecahedron. So this plane is slightly facing up and towards us. This plane is facing down and moving away from us. The same way this plane is moving away from us from a point closer to us to a point further back in space. So when we're dealing with simple geometric forms, we have a pretty good sense, or we can pretty easily, maybe I shouldn't say easily, but we can with clarity represent how those objects are moving through space. So we're going to use that principle when we're painting when we're painting more complex forms. Okay, so this is just a line drawn, and we have a pretty good sense of how these objects are moving through space. Before I go, let me just do something here. So we're talking about planes. And planar structure. As that relates to painting. So all we have right now is a line drawing. Now when we think about these objects illuminated by a light source, we can enhance that representation of three-dimensional volume moving through space even more. So what will we know happens to these objects if they are being illuminated from a light source coming from the left and slightly above? we know that the planes that are facing the light source, or almost facing the light source, are going to be strongly illuminated. So in this situation, it's likely that the top plane of the box is going to be receiving a nearly full it's going to be pretty fully illuminated. We can understand how that plane is oriented in relationship to the direction of the light source, and we can assign that plane a degree of illumination. So that plane is strongly illuminated. Now, I think my drawing is maybe not as clear as it could be in this regard, but I think that this plane is still facing the light source, but it's maybe facing the light source. Let's see, this way. No, actually, I think given the light source, so we have light coming from the upper left, and the rays of light would come like this as they emanate off of the light source. So we have two planes on this box that are approximately equal in illumination. So each of these planes are facing the light source in the same degree. Now, the one I think, I'm guessing, so now I'm doing this out of my head, but I think that given the direction and the location of the light source, the top plane will be slightly more strongly illuminated. So I'm going to give that just a little bit more clarity. I'm going to give that a little bit of a lighter value, so that it reads as a little bit more strongly illuminated. So this plane is the most strongly illuminated. The plane on the left is slightly less illuminated. And then this plane is completely turned away from the light source. So that plane is going to be almost completely in shadow. So if I'm assuming that this is a kind of middle tone, I'm going to give that plane just a slightly darker tone. So that plane goes to shadow. So there is no more light, there's no light hitting that plane. And so we can understand without even looking at an object, when we're dealing with simple geometric forms, we can start to imagine or conceptualize the way these forms will respond to the light source. If we know where the light source is and the direction of that light source, and the direction of the light source. So let's take that one step further. So we have a very simple light and dark situation. And so if people remember last week, we talked about what will happen when an object blocks light from hitting it. We're going to have a cast shadow. So I'm just fixing the drawing a little bit. I think my perspective is moving to the screen. I think that this line should come down a little bit. Better. So now with some of the basic principles we've learned so far, value relationships, degrees of lightness and darkness, the simple idea, the simple concept of how objects respond to a light source. Now we add in planar thinking. We can start to develop a pretty good sense of the way we can start to represent three-dimensional objects on a flat surface. Okay. So now that's a very simple geometry. So what happens to a more complex geometry? Well, something very similar. We just get a different arrangement of the values. So if illuminating the dodecahedron with the same light source. So notice that the light is coming at this direction, right? The plane, the upper left plane of the dodecahedron is pretty much directly parallel to that light source. That means that that plane on the dodecahedron should be the lightest plane in the set. So that should be, if these are white objects, I'm imagining these as white objects, that plane should be the brightest plane in the set. So again, that plane is getting a that's directly parallel to the direction of the light source. So this plane, this plane is going to be by far, not by necessarily by far, but it's going to be the lightest plane in the center. So actually, I should have anticipated that. Let's take a little bit of paint off of this plane, because this is going to be slightly darker. Than the upper left plane in the dodecahedron. Putting down a different white. This is a white called titanium white, and it's a lighter, brighter white. So if this plane is directly facing the light source, then this plane, which is roughly parallel to the plane on our cube, this plane and this plane are both turned away from the light source. So let's put those two planes. So those are both planes completely in shadow. And then so these two planes, again, are completely in shadow. And for now, I'm going to make them the same value. We'll revisit that. We'll ask if one of these might be a slightly different value than another when we talk about it with a little bit more complexity. But for now, since these planes, again, are turned completely away from the light source, we can think of these planes as being completely in shadow. So now, what happens to these planes? Okay, if this plane is directly parallel, right, to the light source, this plane is turned away, but not completely away from the light source. So that plane is still receiving some light. Right? So the question is, how much light? So that's going to be illuminated, but because it's at an oblique angle to the light source, in other words, it's not directly facing the light source, it's going to be illuminated, but not nearly as light as the brightest plane. Not, again, not completely turned away from the light, but it's at an angle, it's at an oblique angle. So it's not going to be full. Now, what happens to this plane? This plane, if we think about these planes and their orientation to the light source, and what happens to that as they turn away from the light. This plane is directly facing the light source. This plane is turned slightly away from the light source. This plane is turned away even more. So then that plane needs to be darker than this one. Not as dark as the shadow planes, but darker than this one. So that plane will perhaps be a value something like that. Be a value something like this. Now I'm doing this from my head. We actually had a good decahedron up here and illuminated the light source. Something slightly different. But it's for sure going to be a darker plane because it's turning under and away from the light source. So I'm going to, I'll just clarify my shape a little, and then we'll also put just like our cube, our dodecahedron will have a cast shadow. Something like this. So we have a simple block-in of these simplified planar forms. And again, we've thought about the way those planes are going to change in value depending on their orientation to the light source. The more directly a plane faces the light source, the more illuminated it's going to be. And the more it's turned away from the light source, the darker it's going to be. I forgot one plane. So I think the top's going to be slightly darker than the brightest plane, maybe a little bit, but a little bit lighter than this. Okay, so last week, we talked pretty extensively about the elements of light and shadow, right? So we talked about light side, dark side, form shadow, cast shadow, right? We also talked about reflected light, highlight. So if you remember back to some of those elements that we talked about, how could we possibly make this simple light and dark situation a little bit more complicated and a little bit more believable? I don't want to say believable, but like, where can we add complexity to this light and dark situation? Like, what would create a little bit more variety in the values we're looking at?
Could you include halftones?
I'm sorry?
Halftones?
I can't hear you for some reason.
Halftones?
Well, yeah, halftones, but would there be halftones here?
Maybe not, because the planes are they're not very complex. They're just facing one way, so I guess not as much.
Right, so there's not really going to be halftones because there's such an abrupt change from one plane to another. There would be a halftone, like a very tiny halftone, but we wouldn't really pick it up with our eye. Do you know what I mean? Like, because it's not an absolutely razor sharp. What about reflected light? Like, what happens with reflected light? Does anyone remember? Like, how would reflected light change what we've blocked in on this painting?
It would make the sections pop out more because it would divide each plane.
Can you say that again?
It would like separate each section out because it would make a definition between each plane.
Yeah, we would see a little bit more clarity of each plane. That's right. So let's remember what reflected light does. So reflected light, actually, who just said that?
It was me, Kayla.
Who was it?
Kayla.
Kayla. So what does, when we're talking about reflected light, what are we talking about? Reflected light what is reflected light?
It's the light that pops back. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time describing it, but it's like the light that pops back on the shadows.
Yeah, so reflected light is, we say reflected light as opposed to direct light, right? So this is the direct light, right? So the direct light coming from the upper left, and again, that's hitting planes that are directly facing that light source or turned away from it at an oblique angle. So not completely turned away from it, but turned away from it at a slight angle. But then reflected light is light that hits surfaces really all around the objects and then bounces back into the shadows. So if light's coming from the upper left, and let's say hitting off this tabletop here, that light is going to reflect back in to certain planes on the object. So what we're going to see here, again, this is something we can, if we have a simple conceptualization of an object, and we have, and we know where the light's coming from, then we can start imagining how the reflected light's going to work. So these two planes are both turned away from the light source. But this plane is going to be getting some pretty strong reflected light off of this surface. So light is going to be hitting the surface and then bouncing back into this plane. So we are almost definitely going to see this plane as slightly lighter than this plane. Because light is reflecting off of the table and bouncing back into that plane. So that's going to help us clarify each plane in relationship to each other and the way those planes are moving through space. So that plane is not quite as light as this plane, but it's lighter than that. Now, and probably, in fact, the very bottom part of this plane, the part of that plane closest to the reflecting surface is probably going to be slightly lighter. And then the intensity of the reflected light will fade off as we move up that plane. And it's possible, so if, as I've imagined, these two objects are next to each other, it's possible that there's going to be light reflecting off this plane and bouncing back in to the plane of this cube so that we get a bit of reflected light here. Now, it's going to be very subtle, but it's going to be there. You get a little bit of reflected light, something like that. That would be very subtle. That's probably. We're also, depending on how far we would want to take this, we're probably going to see highlights, probably on those corners. So that's a simple conceptualization of light and shadow on simple planar objects. So I want to apply that thinking to a simple, a somewhat simple organic form. It's simple, but it's more complex than the form we used last week. switch this out. So I'm gonna now look at the still life setup I have. I'm gonna look at that pair. And again, you want to please use the image I sent you as reference so you can see what I'm looking at, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're going to try to understand that simple form as we're going to try to understand that geometric form as a simple organic, as a planar object in such a way that it will help us clearly represent that form and its organic complexity. So that we believe that it's moving through space. So I'm going to split my canvas in two. And what I want people to do for next week is I want you to do two representations of a simple organic object. I actually think a pair is the best thing to use because it's both organic, but it has an inherent structure that is planar. But there are some other objects you could use. I'll send you a list of recommended objects. Just to let you know now, I avoid using an apple because apples are not very, they don't conform well to this project, and they have too many variations of color. So you want to choose a simple organic object that has a single color and that has something of a planar structure. Okay, so I could, when we're looking at an object like the pair I'm working from, we often have an impulse when we're drawing something like that to sort of do this, to go, to sort of like do this generic thing. And then we start, just kind of arbitrarily filling in light and shadow wherever we see it. We want to be a little bit more analytical. We want to really try to understand the structure of this object, the planar structure of this object, and how we can use that planar structure to really clearly represent that object as a three-dimensional volume in space. So I'm going to first, on the left-hand side, do a drawing of that object where I carve out or find the plane. So I'm going to draw that object, paying careful attention to the way I can interpret that object as a planar structure. So something similar to that dodecahedron. So how can I find on that object, or where are the planes on that object that allow me to see that as a volume moving through space? So I'm starting with a very simple straight line contour. And I'm doing that because that helps me see the planar structure of the object. I'm also doing it for a drawing trick I will point out in a second, or a drawing technique for seeing. Let's put it that way. In a second. So I started with a rough in of the contour. And I actually think I made my hair too narrow. So I'm going to use the same trick I used last week, or the same technique to find the proportion of the height to the width. So I'm going to take the width, and I'm going to see how many times that width goes into the height. So it goes into it once with just a little bit left over. So if this is how tall my hair is, the width of it should be to about there. So that means my hair needs to be about this wide. So I'm going to change that. And using this straight line technique to block in the object. So the straight line technique is a common technique in a kind of classical drawing. And part of the reason we use a straight line technique as an initial block in is, one, it helps us understand these objects in terms of their planar structure. Because each of these straight lines on the contour correspond to an interior plane. The same way the straight line on the contour of this dodecahedron corresponds to the direction of that plane. Right? The angle of that straight line tells us the angle of that interior plane. And so if we're thinking about organic objects as constructed of a series of planes, this helps us understand that aspect of them. The other thing that blocking in a straight line contour really helps with is I can clearly make point-to-point, side-to-side angle comparisons. So how high should the shoulder on this swelling of the contour be compared to the height of that corresponding swelling on the other side of that hair. So this swelling is higher than this swelling. And I can make a series of cross-contour comparisons very easily when I started with a straight line contour. It makes it very easy to look at and find the relationships, these what we call cross-contour relationships between points. Actually, scratch it. We don't call that cross-contour. Cross-contour is something else. The point-to-point angle relationships from one side of the contour to the other. So that's my simple block in of the contour. And I know that this kind of drawing seems counterintuitive often to people, but it's very easy to go from this kind of contour, then to just make slight adjustments so that you end up with a contour that's absolutely believable as an organic form. Okay, but so I'm starting with this. Now, I want to find on that object, or ask myself, how can I interpret that object as a series of planes? And if I look at the light on that object, how the light is breaking on that object, where the light is lightest, where the light has middle values, and where the light is in shadow, I can actually start to use that light to understand the planes on that object. So if you look at your image, let's look at the bottom contour of the object, which we can draw as two straight lines meeting at a kind of front corner. Let's look at the shadow pattern of that object. Where does the shadow start? So the shadow pattern starts roughly at this bottom front corner, because that's a place where two planes meet and change direction. And the shadow pattern comes up at an angle tilted to the right, and then it changes direction, and then the shadow pattern changes direction again like this, something like that. Then the shadow pattern comes in and makes this little knife shape here. And then we get a kind of tightly arcing pattern of shadow on the right-hand side, and scoops under like this. So what we've done by following that shadow pattern is we've found the initial large shift from the light plane, which is roughly moving in this direction, right, and facing the light source. And we've found the shadow plane, which is turned away from the light source and moving in that direction. Now let's look for the complexity of planes both within the lights and within the shadows. What happens? Look carefully at the image I showed you. What planar differences do we see within the light side of the form? So one easy place to find that difference is I see a highlight right about here. And that highlight actually sits on something that I can discern as a planar shift on the form. So there's a movement, a planar movement like this. So we have a plane on the pair. In other words, a relatively broad, flat area on the pair that's pretty much directly facing the light source. And then from this point here, again, a line that corresponds to the highlight of the form. Then we have a slightly darker halftone plane that's directly facing me, like it's directly facing the viewer. And that slightly darker halftone plane has a somewhat irregular shape. It does something like this. So we have a plane moving backwards in space. Then we have a plane that's facing us. Then we have a plane on the object that's, again, moving backwards in space. Now these planes, unlike, say, the cube or the dodecahedron, are irregular and somewhat organic. Nevertheless, we can still read them, I think, as relatively clear planar divisions on this object. So now I'm seeing a series of planes that do something like this. So here I have a highlight, and then to the left of that highlight and down below, there's a relatively broad flat plane that then transitions into another plane here. Another plane there. I'm going to simplify this plane here, just for the purposes of clarity. So I'm going to take out that little variation in the line of the contour. Let's leave that for later as a kind of detail, which I think is a better way to describe that. And one thing I want to point out, a really important thing actually about painting fruit, is if we look at that pair, really painting any organic object, we can put a pencil on top of that pair, and the pencil will stay there, just as if that pair is a table, right? Pencil will stay on top of that pair. So that pair has a top plane. It has a relatively flat top plane. So we want to indicate that so that we start to, so that the pair doesn't just end at a flat paper-like edge at the top. So there's a small plane at the top of that pair that we could rest that pencil on. So we have, I'm going to make a couple of adjustments. So as I look at this pair a little bit more carefully, I'm going to revise this a little bit. So the planar structure is a little bit more, now as I look at this more carefully, actually with a little bit more of a simplifying eye, which I think will be beneficial for us here. I think the planar structure is more something like this. So I can't turn this, or I can't really see this in terms of a series of absolutely equally shaped planes, but I can start to interpret this object as a series of planes that move through the space, the imaginary space we're constructing in this still life. or the space we're looking at. So now what I want to do, and I think that is a pretty good representation of the obviously simplified planar structure of that object. Now I just want to ask people, is this confusing to anybody, or can I clarify anything about what we just talked about? Because I'm guessing that most people have never been asked to look at an organic object in quite this way. Yeah, so again, can I clarify anything about what I've just explained? Anybody have any questions about it? So I'm going to ask people on the assignment for next week to do two images side by side. The first is going to be a simple line drawing that you're going to keep as a line drawing like this, a geometric line drawing. And then I'm going to repeat this line drawing over here. So and I'd like people to do the same thing. So from whichever object you're working from. So you're going to choose some kind of roughly similar organic object. Again, I would recommend a pair, because I just think it lends itself to this kind of study. It lends itself best to this kind of study. So we're going to do just a line drawing, and then we're going to look at the way the light and the shadow is responding to that planar structure. Okay, so similar to our imagined geometric forms, we're now going to think about this organic object. We're going to be looking at the organic object we're working from and thinking about how we can interpret the light and the dark situation up there in terms of a series of planes. So the first thing I'm going to do, as I did last week, is start by blocking in the values around the object. So before I get involved in the values of the object itself, I'm going to rough in values of the background very broadly. So why don't we actually, it's 3 o'clock, let's take a break. We'll take a 15-minute break and then we'll finish up when we come back, okay?
Professor,
Yeah.
do you have any tips for people who are transitioning from acrylic to oil? It's like a new medium for me, so I'm just kind of like, I don't know what to do.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I have a tip for it. The only thing you need to realize is that, I mean, I guess this is obvious. They work very differently, right? So if you've worked with acrylics before, you know you can put it down, and then very shortly afterwards, you can paint over that dry layer. Where you can't do that with oil paint, because oil paint stays wet for a while. Have you tried? Have you painted with oil paint yet, or this will be the first time?
I've painted with it, not well, mostly because of those problems where it's like, I try to use it in a way like acrylic, and then it just kind of like all becomes a sloppy mess.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a little bit hard for me to answer. Can you hear me? Can you hear me as I'm talking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hard for me to answer, because to be honest with you, I really have done very little painting with acrylic. I've done some, but all of my experience is mostly with oil paint. So I don't have like a huge amount of experience to draw from. I mean, maybe it'd be easier if you, like, what's a specific problem you're having? Like,
When I'm trying, oh, sorry. When I'm trying to blend things together, it either becomes like really thick lines, like it doesn't look pretty, or it like becomes like one flat color.
Everything sort of merges together.
Yeah.
Well, I'll talk about, I mean, I'll continue to talk about how to like keep the clarity of those differences. You know, part of it really is just going to be continuing to practice with it. There's no real like silver bullet, I can tell you. It's, you know, it has to do with like developing, just getting a sense of a certain touch. Because, you know, I think working with oil paint just requires a slightly different touch in order to be able to control those things you're talking about. But you know, as I do these demos, I'll try to remember that and like point that out when I'm using some of those techniques that I think would be helpful. I think that might be the best way to explain it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Professor.
Yes.
Hi. I'm the new student. I'm Anna Ariel.
Yeah. Hi. How you doing?
Good. I wanted to ask you. Is this class? It's all gonna be in oil paint?
It's all gonna be oil paint. Yes.
Okay. So we all need to have oil paint at home.
I'm sorry?
So we all need to have oil paint at home. Like we're not using any other mediums.
I will introduce a medium you can use like with your oil paint, but the only material you need to buy are the oil paints that are on the list.
Okay, and we don't need like ventilation if we don't have ventilation in our house for like
you don't, if you're concerned, I mean, it's helpful to have a window. But if you look over the materials list, I include, instead of using mineral spirits, use Gamsol. That is a kind of paint thinner that has all harmful elements removed from it. So it's a little bit more expensive, but I would recommend using Gamsol. the fumes, like oil paint does have a certain smell, but it's not dangerous.
Okay.
You know, the only, like, you know, I mean, if the smell bothers you, you know, but it's not a strong smell. I mean, are you having problems at your home right now, or you're just anticipating?
Normally, I don't use oil paints because it's toxic and I have little kids in the house. So usually I only use acrylic.
Okay, so you have kids.
I don't have my own kids. I have like little kids who come, like little siblings in the house, like nieces.
Well, oil paint is not toxic. I mean, there are some oil paints that are toxic, but I don't. You know, there are some pigments that are toxic, like any pigments that are made with heavy metals are toxic. So there's a kind of white called flake white. That's toxic if you eat it. There are kinds of reds, yellows, and oranges that are made with cadmium, and that's toxic if you eat it. Or it's toxic if you have to get it inside your system. So you have to either eat it, or you have to like rub it all over your body, or you have to let it dry and then sand it and create like, you know, a kind of cloud of dust that you breathe in. But most artists don't do that. You know, so like even those heavy metal pigments are safe to use if you're controlling the situation. Now, having said that, I don't ask anybody to buy any of those pigments. So all of the pigments that you buy are non-toxic, and they're ground in linseed oil, which is a vegetable oil. So linseed oil is pressed from flax seeds. So none of those paints should be technically toxic. And then odorless mineral spirits it's kind of low-grade flammable, but it's not more flammable than something like nail polish remover or other things we use around the house. So in terms of the materials I've asked people to buy, they're safe. You know, unless, you know, I don't know how safe a tube of paint would be if you ate the whole thing. Sorry, I'm right on a busy street. But really, in general, the materials I've asked you to buy are only non-toxic oil paints. And then the solvent called Gamsol, which is one of the options on the list, is the safest solvent that's made. It's barely flammable. It's safe to store in a closet. All of the harmful, I forget what they're called, but the things in certain solvents that really smell bad, those have been almost entirely removed. So it's really quite safe to use at home. And especially if you have an average sized room or larger with windows, you're perfectly safe. So, you know, I personally don't have any hesitation asking people to use these materials at home in that regard. The only question really for me is that oil paint can be a little bit messy. You know, so I think some people's parents might be hesitant to, you know, see their kids using oil paints at the dining room table or something like that. But, you know, if you can put down any kind of like drop cloth or protective covering that you would do if you were engaged in a craft project at home, or if you were painting part of your home, you know, really you should be able to control the situation so that these materials never lead to a situation where you've created a horrible mess. So, I mean, where are you painting at home?
I paint on the dining room table.
I mean, is it your home or is it your parents'?
My parents.
Are they uptight about like keeping things spotless?
Yeah.
Okay, then I would certainly put down like a drop cloth. Do you have carpeting?
Yeah.
Okay, then certainly, if you can get an inexpensive painter's drop cloth at the hardware store, it's a sheet of plastic. Just put that down over your work surface and put that down over the carpet. That would be my advice. I mean, and oil paint's actually easier to get out of clothing than acrylic paint is, because acrylic paint dries so fast that you have a very short window to get it out, where oil paint stays wet. So if you work it with soap and water, you can generally, with very few exceptions, get the oil paint out of clothing. Of course, carpeting is a different issue. But like acrylic paint would be as bad for carpeting as oil paint would. So, I'm confident that, of course it's not ideal to work at home, but I'm pretty confident that, with certain controls, these materials are perfectly safe in terms of our health. And, you should be able to create a controlled situation where they're not messy. Okay. Does that make sense, or are you still cautious about it?
It makes sense. I understand. Thank you.
So if any issues come up, just let me know. And what I'll do is I'll just double check my list of oil paints I sent to people and make absolutely sure none of them are toxic. I mean, I definitely didn't ask anybody to order any of the heavy metal pigments. But I'll just double check and make sure. And if anything is even potentially slightly toxic, I'll find a replacement, okay?
Thank you so much, Professor. I really appreciate it. But I'm just like wondering out of curiosity, there's like no way to do this course in acrylics?
Well, the problem with using acrylic is I can't really help you, because I have used acrylics before, but I've almost never used them. And acrylic paint for the kind of painting we're doing is generally not used, right? Like acrylic paints are an invention of the 1950s. And, usually acrylic paints are used for, various forms of abstract painting, or, just a different approach to painting. Look, people are working at home. So if anybody is really concerned about any of these issues we just discussed, then you can replace these materials with acrylic paint. I'm not going to hold that against you, but I'm not the best person to instruct you in the use of acrylic paint. The kinds of paintings we do, there are people who do them with acrylic paint, but it's a certain kind of laborious technique. So, if you decide you would prefer to use acrylic paint, then, what you can do is your best. And, I'll try to help you as much as I can. But I do want to emphasize that this class is designed primarily to be taught in oil paint.
All right, thank you so much, Professor.
Sure. You're welcome. Okay, so hopefully everybody's back. So I blocked in the background and the cast shadow, which again, as we talked about last week, I would like people to always start their paintings by first blocking in the background, first, because it will be hard for me to determine what value this plane should be if I can't see it next to this value here. And so I want to have a rough in of the values that I'm going to be, that I'm seeing the object that we're most interested in this case, the pair. I want to see those values next to the values that surround it. So I'm always going to start by blocking in the background. And remember, a really important part of successfully making paintings like we want to make is always painting the light masses and the shadow masses as separate areas. Okay? But anyway, I got that, I blocked that in during the break. Okay, so now I'm going to look at, now I have my hair drawn in, having paid attention to what I perceive to be a kind of simplified version of the planar structure on that hair. Now, I want to emphasize something. I didn't invent this, right? This is obviously not exactly what a pair looks like, right? A pair has softer transitions. It doesn't have corners like this. But what I'm doing is I haven't invented. Instead, I've interpreted the organic planes on the pair I'm looking at in a way that reveals to me what I call the underlying geometric structure of the object. And I'm doing that again, just to emphasize again, so that it's clear. Remember, we want to make the painting of that pair appear to be a completely believable three-dimensional object in space. So a completely believable object that we could almost, as if we could put our hand into that space and pick up that object. So I need to make this part of the pair appear closer to me than this part, right? I need to make this part of the pair appear closer to me than that part of the table. And we've talked about how it's relatively easy with geometric forms to create the illusion that those forms are moving through space, right? When we're dealing with objects made up of a series of clear planes. So in order to optimize or to make as strong as possible the illusion of that object being a fully believable three-dimensional form in space, I'm starting the process by interpreting it as a series of geometric planes. So I'm using the information I'm looking at in the object to interpret the geometric planes that are up there on that page. So now if it's true that the geometric planes on that pair are configured something like I've drawn them here, I'm now going to start asking myself, how do those geometric planes determine the values of the surface of that pair as that pair wraps around in space? So the first thing I'm going to look at is thinking about the direction of the light. So the direction of the light is very similar in this setup to the direction of the light in our imaginary geometric form. So the light's coming like this. And so planes of that pair that are facing the light source are strongly illuminated. And so the lightest lights on this pair are not quite white, because obviously the local color of that pair is green. But the planes that are most directly facing the light source, this plane this transitional top plane, those planes are directly facing the light source. And again, if you look at the reference image, I think you'll see that those planes are the lightest planes on the object. And given the direction of the light source, it appears to me that this plane here, again, that plane that we kind of think of as like the shoulder of the pair, that plane also is a lighter plane, one of the lightest planes on the object. And then the top plane of the pair, that very top plane, or kind of tabletop of the pair, where our pencil was resting. That's also a very light plane. So again, looking at the pair that we've drawn. Now, as I'm painting this, I'm seeing some ways I could slightly change that configuration of planes. I feel like I'm seeing it a little bit more clearly. Okay, so let's call this the shoulder of the pair. And I'll give that a little bit more, slightly more organic variation. Now, as the shoulder of the pair changes direction into this left-hand side plane of the pair, this plane gets a little bit darker. Not dramatically darker, but it's a little bit darker. Now, very slightly darker as the very front-facing plane turns slightly away from the light source. That's darker still. That's obviously still getting some light, but it's somewhat darker. So what we're looking at, depending on the direction of the plane relative to the light sources, we're getting a series of variations in the value of that plane. The more the plane is turned towards the light source, the lighter it's going to be. The more it's turned away from the light source, the darker it's going to be. So there are slight differences between those planes. So the planes that are slightly tilted up towards the light are just a little bit lighter than the planes that are more vertical. Now notice this front plane here. It's a plane that's facing me, right? This plane is square to the plane of the camera lens, right? So that plane is square to my plane of vision as I'm looking at the object. And this plane is slightly darker than this plane because this plane is oriented in such a way that it's facing up towards the light source. So this plane is going to be slightly darker. Now moving down below as we move from this plane here, right, this plane, which is facing something like this. Then we transition to this plane, which goes like this. And then right here, that plane starts to turn under. So that plane has now started to move slightly more away from the light. So this plane now starts to get a little bit darker. It's not in complete shadow. That's a halftone. That plane is now turning away from, it's more turning away from the light source. You know, and as people can see, I've drawn these planes as if they're a little bit more geometrically regular and clear than they actually are up on the object. But I hope you can see how they correspond to the light and the plane on the object we're looking at. And then as we go from this plane to this plane, we've really now turned under, away from the light source. This plane, like this plane, is no longer facing the light source. This may be getting just the slightest rake of light, just the slightest. A little too dark. Now this plane here is complicated because there's a kind of dimple in there that makes it a little bit complicated. I'll deal with that in a second. It's also a relatively dark plane. Let's simplify it for now. So now we have all of the planes, or we've indicated all the planes that are fully illuminated, or at least receiving somewhat. Now all of the planes from this line over to the right, this line is the shadow edge or the terminator, and then all of these planes over here are in shadow. So all of those planes are turned completely away from the light source. So this entire mass, we can, as an initial block in, just block this entire mass in as a shadow mass. And if you look at that value is quite dark, right? Its local color is green. You know that's a green object. But because the planes of that green object are so completely turned away from the light source, it's now a very dark, sort of brownish gray. We no longer see that color as green, and we certainly don't see it anywhere near the same value as the light side of this form. So all of these planes are going to be all within that shadow mass. Just to clarify the drawing, I'm going to put in this line here, a very dark shadow. Anyone remember what we call that? What do we call that very dark shadow? Anyone remember the name of the darkest part of the shadow?
Cast shadow?
This is the cast shadow. Well, what's the name of the very darkest part of the shadow?
Occlusional?
I'm sorry?
Occlusional or something like that?
Occlusion shadow. We can also just call it the shadow accent. Either way. Just putting the occlusion shadow. Okay, so now in a way, this would be a good place to bring painting. Because I think doing this would help people learn a lot about planar structure and the way we understand the form of objects in space in relationship to a light source. But I want to add a few more things that we can observe on the pair and interpret in terms of the planar structure that will reinforce what we know about light and shadow. So again, if the light is coming from the upper left, and then is bouncing off the table there, we're going to see a reflected light. I'm just going to check the photo I sent to you. I want to make sure that shows up in the photo. Yeah, so you can see that reflected. I just want to check participants. Okay. So, so if our Sorry, just double checking my phone so I can hear if anyone texts me, get in. Okay, so if the light is coming from the left and bouncing off various surfaces around it, but particularly right here, we're going to have a reflected. We're going to have a reflected light bouncing back into the shadow side of the form. And thinking about the planar structure of this object, the reflected light is going to be strongest on the plane that is most strongly facing the reflecting surface. So we're getting a pretty strong reflected light on the plane of the pair that's turned down towards the reflecting surface of the plane. And that reflected light continues along the entirety of that plane. Again, that plane that's most facing the reflected surface. And there's also a slightly darker, but nevertheless a reflected light on a plane right here. And we're getting again a reflected light, not a very bright one. I'm going to make it a little bit stronger than it is. It's a little bit, so the reflected light goes from stronger here, slightly more subtle here. So those reflected lights are corresponding to the direction of a plane that is facing the direction of a reflecting surface. And again, interpreting that in relationship to clarity in relationship to the planes and the object. So I'll also, now let's put in some half-tone planes to just start to create a kind of sense of an organic transition. So what I mean by that, so let's look here. So we have this front half-tone plane that turns into a shadow. But then there's another plane between those two. That acts as that softening half. It starts to just transition that edge. So that we get closer and closer to, as we put more planes in, we get closer and closer to a convincing depiction of the organic form we're looking at. And in some ways, we can think of a convincing organic form as a form in which the full complexity of planes have been accounted. We're seeing the highlight right at the meeting points of 4 planes. That's true of this highlight as well. And let's see. So now, because this is an organic form, it obviously doesn't have the regularity that I started out, kind of absolute regularity. So you'll notice there's a little dimple down here where there's a shift in the direction of this underplane. So we're getting a little bit more light down there. Something like that. And so we can start now to understand how we can conceive of or start to understand how to construct a complex form so that it reads as existing in and moving through space. So I want to emphasize that I don't mean that we're going to be painting things like this and just keeping them this way. This is an exercise so that people develop a way of thinking about objects in terms of their planar structure. So all organic objects have a planar structure like this. You want to be able to identify that and use that as you're conceptualizing the complicated organic object you're painting so that it's as convincing as possible. So I'm just making some adjustments. I see some of my values need to change a little bit. That value should be a little bit lighter. Some of these, I could make some of these transitions just a little bit softer. Still work. I would probably, I feel like my reflected lights are a little bit too pronounced. So soften those. So this is what I would like people to do. Again, I want to emphasize that you need to set up your own still life. I would, again, strongly recommend a pear, an orange sometimes will work. What else works? Like a quince, although you can't find those around here so easily. certain lemons will work. You know, you have to get one that has like a good structural, like clarity of planar form. So any kind of organic object like that, get an organic object that has one color. So avoid fruit that has a mottled or multicolored appearance, because at this stage in the process, it's just going to confuse you. So don't use like a Macintosh apple or a peach or something like that. Avoid any fruit that has more than one color. Set the still life up like I did today, and try to find that, you know, what I've been calling that underlying geometric structure to the object you're working from. Does anybody have any questions about that? Or any questions in general?
Professor, will we be getting any feedback from our first assignment?
Yes. So did people submit that to Blackboard?
Yeah, I submitted on Blackboard.
Okay.
Yes, I did too.
Yeah, me
Okay.
too.
So I'm going to look at them. I haven't looked at them yet. I apologize. I'm going to look at them, and then I guess I'll schedule. I'll look at the schedule and figure out when we can have a time that I'll schedule individual meetings and talk about the first painting. Okay.
I actually have a question about the painting.
Go ahead.
So for when you first initially start, right? Should I just put like paint thinner all around the board just to make it so it's smoother?
Just to make it what?
Smoother to paint on, because I noticed that when I was painting on it, it was really hard to apply the oil onto the board, the canvas.
Yeah. So yeah, I know that these canvas boards are a little bit absorbent and they're a little bit rough.
Yeah.
What I would advise you to recommend doing is, so there's like the easy approach and then there's a little bit more complex, which meaning it would involve buying something. Actually, what I do before I paint every day, before I do these demos, is I sand the board.
Oh.
So I take, hold on one second. So I take 150 grade sandpaper. So a piece of 150 grade sandpaper. It's, you know, you get a couple sheets like this. It's very inexpensive at the hardware store. And I give it a good, I give it a good sanding. I go over it, you know, pretty aggressively a couple times. That's going to take off a lot of that. That's going to take off a lot of that tooth that's interfering with you putting the paint down. So that would be my first recommendation. And that actually makes a big difference. So just in that amount of sanding I did, you know, this side that I sanded is much smoother than this side, okay? Who was asking me that? I'm sorry.
Me, it's Tommy.
Tommy, okay. Do you have any experience painting before this, or is this the first time you've painted?
Yeah, it's the first time I picked up the brush.
Okay, so give me one
oil.
So that's the easy thing. So you can get sandpaper. I would recommend 150 grade or 200 grade sandpaper, and give it a good sanding. You can get that at any corner hardware store. You can get it at Home Depot, anything like that. You can probably get it at Michael's. Okay, so then just a little bit of information about what surfaces that artists use. So most artists, when they're doing oil paintings, they paint on canvas. But the canvas has been coated with a primer. And an artist primer is this stuff. It's called GESSO, gesso, artist gesso. You can get this at a hardware, at an art supply store. This is probably $8, something like that. And what I do every day is I sand it, and then I put another coat of this on it. I coat the whole thing with gesso, a very thin layer of gesso, and that eliminates that absorbency, and it just gives it one more layer of primer, and it makes it much easier to apply the paints. So I'll actually, I'll give a link to this stuff if anyone's interested in getting it. So I'm also going to give a link to a couple other optional supplies, but that's what I would recommend doing.
Yeah, can I get the link for that? Because I noticed that when I was painting with the oil, I ended up using like half the bottle already because I don't know why.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I'll give you the link. You know, I didn't want to throw too much information at people, but these boards, particularly the student grade boards, they're very absorbent and they are hard to put paint on. So I'll give you a link to all that information.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about anything?
Yeah, Professor, I have a question. Are we supposed to draw that arrow in as well? If we
don't have to draw the arrow. I just draw that as a, you know, just so it's clear that we all understand where the light's coming from. No, you don't need to draw that.
Okay, so we're doing both paintings and submitting it. We're doing both paintings, like the...
Yeah, so, you know, the easiest thing to do would be to split the 11 by 14 inch board and do the drawing, the line drawing, and then the painting.
Okay, thank you.
But this is the only thing you're doing. You don't have to do that painting where I invented geometric forms. I just want to be clear about that. This is the only thing you need to do.
Okay, one more dumb question. So we're doing it on the canvas panel for both of them? Or do you want to do it on like the paper and then one?
No, I would do it on the canvas board.
Okay, yeah. Got you. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I'm sorry, yeah, I have a question. I just
Sure.
got a little confused. So what we're looking at right now, like the two pieces, that's what we're submitting, just our own, the one that's just like the lines and then the one that has everything else, correct?
Yeah, so what you're looking at, the painting you're looking at now next to my palette, that's the only painting you're going to make. So a painting split down the middle with the line drawing on one side and then the blocked in planar study of a piece of fruit on the other.
Okay, all right.
And I'll add that assignment to Blackboard, okay?
And Professor, do you have a preference as to how much we blend out between the planes, like in the painting on the right? Do you want us to leave it slightly how it is there?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it could be a little bit more. If you want to leave it a little bit more geometric, that's fine. But I don't want you to go from this and then smooth it all out. Leave it geometric. If you want to make it a little bit more geometric, that's fine.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Sure. Okay, so again, people can feel free to email me if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna look at the assignments that were handed in, and then we'll arrange a time that we'll talk about those. And maybe we should do that next week, but I'll let everybody know. So if there aren't any more questions, I'll just see you all on next Wednesday. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, I'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.